I asked for 4 days. 4 days to bury the man who raised me alone, who taught me that family is worth more than any paycheck. But when I stood in front of my boss in HR, they didn't see a son grieving. They saw an employee asking for what they called a luxury. They denied me just like that. No sympathy, no hesitation. 2 days or join the funeral on Zoom, HR said. Like my father's death was an inconvenience on their calendar. My hands shook, not from sadness but from rage. I nodded, said nothing, and walked out. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought I'd return, humbled, grateful for whatever scraps they offered. But that night, I logged in one last time. I stared at the same files I had built the very backbone of their million-dollar migration. And in that moment, I made a choice. If they wanted me to pick between work and family, I would choose family and take back the lifeline they thought was theirs forever. What happened next left my boss, HR, and even legal scrambling, calling me nonstop, begging for what they had already lost. But the real question is, what do you do when the people you've bled for decide your father's funeral isn't worth 4 days? My name is Daniel Hayes. I'm 37 years old, a systems engineer in Chicago who has spent most of his adult life making sure other people's deadlines were met. Other people's projects succeeded, other people's mistakes didn't sink the ship. I wasn't the loudest or the flashiest, but I was dependable, the kind of man people called at midnight because they knew I would pick up. That was who I was at work. But on the morning my father died, that identity was tested in a way I never expected. The call came before sunrise. Hospitals don't call unless it's bad news. And when I heard the nurse's voice from Bloomington, Indiana, I knew before she said the words. My father, Thomas Hayes, was gone. Heart failure. Quick, merciless, without warning. He'd raised me alone since I was 10 years old. He was the man who showed me how to steady a drill. Who said, if you build something, build it to last longer than you do. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, staring at the gray light pushing through the blinds. My hands numb, my chest hollow. The old coffee pot still smelled faintly of burnt grounds. The thought that I would never hear his whistle in the garage again made it hard to breathe. By 9 o'clock, I forced myself to dress and drive to the office. Not because I cared about work that morning, but because I knew I had to speak to Cheryl, my boss. I needed to ask for 4 days, just 4, to drive back to Indiana, arrange the service, and bury my father. The elevator doors opened and the familiar cold blast of recycled air hit me. It smelled sterile, like metal and carpet glue. The walls were lined with peeling posters about teamwork, each one with cheerful slogans nobody had believed in for years. Walking past them that day, they felt like insults. Cheryl's office sat at the end of the corridor, oversized and over-decorated. I stepped inside. She was already at her desk, typing furiously, her nails clattering against the keyboard like a woodpecker drilling into bark. She didn't look up when I entered. "Cheryl," I said, clearing my throat. "I need to talk to you." Still typing. No acknowledgement, just the steady mechanical sound of her fingers. I stood there a moment, then forced myself to continue. "My dad passed away this morning. The funeral's in Bloomington. I'll need 4 days to make the trip and handle the arrangements." She stopped for half a breath, exhaled as if I had interrupted something more important than death. Then finally lifted her eyes. Her expression was flat, a wall I had seen 100 times in meetings when someone asked for resources. "You can have 2, she said, clipped as though delivering a memo about printer paper. 2, just 2. My father's life reduced to 48 hours on her calendar. It's a 9-hour drive each way, I said, my voice catching. That barely gives me time to get there, let alone. Her phone buzzed. She smiled suddenly, a soft, sweet smile I had never seen directed at me, and answered, "Yes, honey. I'll see you at lunch," she said lightly into the receiver. When she hung up, the warmth vanished. Her eyes locked back on mine. 2 days, Daniel. That's the best I can do. My throat went dry. I thought of the countless weekends I had given up, the midnight calls I had answered, the disasters I had quietly fixed so she could take credit on Monday mornings. My father had lived 68 years, and now I was being told his burial wasn't worth more than 2 days away from my desk. "I can't watch my father's funeral on Zoom," I said. The words scraped out of me like gravel. "This isn't optional." Her face hardened. She leaned back, folded her arms, and said, "Everyone is expected to be present for the Norland migration. You'll have to choose, Daniel, work or family." It landed like a slap, work or family, as though they balanced the same on some invisible scale, as though missing my father's last goodbye was no more costly than missing a Tuesday meeting. My ears rang with heat, my hands shook, not from grief anymore, but from rage. A dozen things fought to come out of my mouth. I wanted to demand she repeat those words, looking me straight in the eye. I wanted to shout that 3 years of sacrifice meant nothing to her. But instead I did what she least expected. I swallowed the fury, nodded once, and turned away. I stepped into the hallway, its gray carpet stretching like a lifeless river between rows of cubicles. Faces lifted briefly, then dropped back down. Their eyes dulled by habit. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked. The silence was deafening. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't check it. I kept walking, the words still echoing, work or family. Choose. At the elevator, I pressed the button and stared at the polished metal doors. My reflection looked hollow, smaller somehow. But inside, something had shifted. They thought my silence meant surrender. They didn't know it was the beginning of something else entirely. And as the doors slid shut, sealing me off from Cheryl's office and everything it stood for, I knew one thing for certain: they would regret forcing me to choose. The elevator doors closed behind me, but their words kept echoing. Work or family, choose. The ride down felt endless, yet by the time I stepped into the night air, something inside me had hardened. My father was gone, and the place I had given so much of myself to had just measured his death in hours. I drove home in suits, my grip tight on the steering wheel, headlights carving a pale P through the city streets. When I reached my apartment, I didn't bother turning on the lights. The space felt hollow, shadows clinging to the corners, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I set my keys on the counter, sat down, and let the weight of 3 years press against me all at once. 3 years of overtime. 3 years of fixing disasters that weren't mine to own. I remembered nights when the office lights were dark except for the glow from my cubicle when Cheryl had already gone home. Yet I stayed, piecing together code and patching processes that someone else had broken. I remembered weekends sacrificed, birthdays skipped, flu symptoms ignored, because I believed that being indispensable meant being valued. But as I sat there in the quiet, the truth hit me with an almost physical force. All those sacrifices had been written off as routine. My loyalty wasn't respected. It was exploited. My father's funeral was the proof stamped in ink. The clock read 11:30 p.m. when I finally pushed myself up from the chair and walked into my small bedroom. The air smelled faintly of dust and old coffee, a smell I suddenly associated with every long night I had worked for them. My laptop sat waiting on the desk, the little green light on the charger glowing like an eye. I lowered myself into the chair, opened it, and felt the familiar hum as it woke up. My pulse quickened. I had logged in hundreds of times before on holidays, on sick days, when no one else would take responsibility, but tonight was different. Tonight I wasn't logging in to save anyone. Tonight I was logging in to take back what was mine. The screen filled with familiar dashboards, rows of files and folders I knew better than the back of my hand. I didn't touch client data. I didn't steal anything that wasn't mine. What I did was open the directories where I had built my own arsenal over the years, integration manuals written at midnight when the official documentation failed. Troubleshooting notes created after weekends of trial and error. API call structures I had diagrammed from scratch because nobody else understood them. Config backups polished and labeled so that disasters could be undone with a single keystroke. This wasn't company property. This was the personal playbook I had built to keep the whole fragile machine standing when everyone else had walked away. One by one, I moved them off the shared drives, encrypted copies into a private folder, and left behind nothing but a single file. Its message was simple: documentation removed by original author. The words glowed on the screen like a tombstone. I leaned back in my chair, chest rising and falling, and felt a long exhale leave my body. It was like cutting the tubing of a hospital IV. Watching the life drain out of the machine that had drained me for years. I typed a resignation letter next. No flowery thanks, no false gratitude, just facts effective immediately. I was done. I attached it to a short email, hit send, and shut the lid. The laptop clicked closed with a sound that felt final, almost ceremonial. For 3 years I had bent myself to their demands, and in less than an hour I had taken it all back. I sat in the dark for a while, listening to the hum of the city outside, the occasional car passing on the wet pavement. My father's face rose in my mind, his calloused hands guiding mine when I was a boy, his voice steady. If you're going to build something, build it to outlast you. That was what I had done at work, and they had treated it like nothing. Now they would feel the absence of what they had taken for granted. I stood and poured myself a glass of water, my hands still trembling slightly. But not from grief this time. From something colder, sharper. Revenge. I whispered into the empty apartment as if to seal the vow: if they force me to choose, I'll choose family. And take back what's mine. When I lay down on the bed, the ceiling above me seemed to press low, the silence thick enough to taste. I closed my eyes but knew I wouldn't sleep. My phone buzzed on the nightstand screen, flashing with incoming calls. I didn't touch it. Instead, I let it vibrate itself quiet. They could call all night. The files were gone, the letter sent, the lifeline severed. But in the morning I would be driving toward Indiana, toward the town where my father's voice still lingered in the garage, toward the people who had known his kindness and would gather to say goodbye. The company could panic, scramble, beg. That was their problem now. My choice was made, and as I drifted into a restless half-sleep, one thought kept burning steady inside me. This was only the beginning. The drive into Indiana felt different than it ever had before. The highways narrowed, the billboards gave way to cornfields, and the air seemed heavier with every mile. By the time I reached my father's town, the silence inside the car was louder than any noise I had left behind in the city. Pulling into the driveway of the old brick house, I felt time folding back on itself. The porch light still flickered when the wind hit just right, and the faint smell of sawdust seeped through the front door as I stepped inside. His boots were by the door, one slightly tipped over as if he had just stepped out to grab the mail. I stood there longer than I should have, hand on the frame, breathing in the memories. The next morning, the chapel was already filling when I arrived. Stained glass windows caught the winter sun, scattering red and blue across the worn carpet. It was small, modest, the kind of place my father would have chosen without hesitation. The pews creaked under the weight of neighbors' old friends, even a few of his students from the community college. Men from the VFW sat shoulder to shoulder, hats clutched in calloused hands. They weren't here for show. They were here because he had touched their lives in ways that never made headlines but mattered more than anything. One by one they approached me with stories. A man I barely recognized clasped my shoulder and said, "Your dad helped me fix my water heater during that ice storm. Wouldn't take a dime." Another smiled through tears. Every July he brought me pie, even though he hated waiting at the bakery. Said it was tradition. Even his barber came holding a small box of sugar cookies. He always complained about haircuts, she laughed, but he never forgot to bring something for me. Each story landed like a hammer and a bomb at the same time. These people valued him. They showed up. Unlike the place I had just left behind here, every gesture was remembered, every kindness echoed. When my old high school shop teacher, Mr. Banner, walked toward me, the years melted. He pulled me into a hug, his glasses fogging with tears. "Your father never stopped bragging about you," he said, voice thick. Every time I saw him, he'd say, "My boy built systems no one else could. He's my pride." You were his whole world. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. For all the times I had doubted whether my work mattered, here was proof it always had, to the only man whose opinion should have counted. After the service, I followed the pastor into a side room. He handed me a small envelope, the paper worn soft with time. My name was on the front in my father's shaky handwriting. Inside was a deed, the house I had just walked into the night before. Scrawled beneath it in blue ink were 6 words for my son who builds to last. The weight of the paper hit harder than any paycheck I had ever received. I sank into the chair, tears sliding down before I could stop them. In that moment I understood. The real inheritance wasn't property or money. It was the belief that what we build, if built with care, can outlive us. As I held the deed, Mr. Banner leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your dad wanted you secure. He wanted you to stand tall no matter what came your way." His words cracked something wide open inside me. At work I had been disposable. At home I was irreplaceable. The contrast cut deeper than any insult Cheryl or HR had ever thrown my way. I walked out of the chapel into the cold afternoon air, the sky pale and cloudless. My phone buzzed in my pocket again and again. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. They could feel the lifeline draining already. I tightened my grip on the deed in my hand, staring at the quiet street where neighbors still left porch lights on for one another. My father had been right all along. Family came first, work came and went. As I turned toward the car, a thought settled heavy in my chest. They had stripped me of dignity in the office, but here, surrounded by people who truly cared, I had found a different kind of power. I slid into the driver's seat, the envelope resting on the passenger side. The calls kept coming more frantic each time, and I knew this wasn't over. Tomorrow they'd demand answers. Tomorrow they'd realize what it meant to lose the one man holding everything together, and tomorrow I'd decide just how high a price they would pay. The morning after the funeral, I sat at my father's kitchen table, the wood worn smooth by decades of coffee cups and Sunday papers. Outside, frost still clung to the grass, and the cold air seeped through the thin windows. But the steam rising from my mug gave the room a fragile warmth. The laptop sat open in front of me, its screen filled with blinking notifications. They had been calling and emailing for days, but now the subject lines had turned desperate. Critical documentation needed. Client disruption urgent. Immediate response requested. I scrolled through them slowly, almost savoring the panic threaded between every line. At exactly 9:00 a.m., I clicked into the Zoom link they had sent for the 3rd time that morning. Cheryl's face appeared first tight and pinched, her hair pulled back so sharply it looked painful. Hal joined next, his collar crooked, eyes red from lack of sleep. A woman I didn't recognize logged in with the word legal beneath her name, and HR's square blinked on a moment later. The silence before anyone spoke was louder than the static on the line. Finally, Hal cleared his throat. "Daniel, we're very sorry about your father. We know this is a difficult time." I let the pause stretch. My father's voice echoed in my head. Silence can be louder than shouting. When I didn't respond, Cheryl jumped in, her tone clipped. "We need access to your documentation immediately. The Norland migration is falling apart without it. Reporting functions are dead and their team is demanding answers." I tilted my head, let the calm spread across my face. "My documentation?" The woman from legal leaned forward. "Yes. It was created on company time. As such, it is considered work product." I almost laughed. Instead, I leaned closer to the camera. "You mean the scripts I wrote at 2 in the morning? The guides I built because no one approved a training budget? The notes I kept so Hal wouldn't forget meetings? That's not company property, that's mine, built on my time, my terms." Cheryl's lips thinned. "Daniel, this isn't the time for..." I cut her off. "No, this is exactly the time. Because now, for the first time, you realize what my work is worth. You can't finish without me, so here are my terms. $300 an hour, 20 hours minimum, paid in advance, and I decide when I'm available." HR leaned forward, eyes wide. "That's unreasonable." "No," I said, sipping my coffee. "That's supply and demand." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Cheryl finally snapped, her voice rising. "That's extortion." I shrugged. "Call it what you want, but if you think you can limp across the finish line without me, be my guest. We'll see what Norland has to say about that." Hal rubbed his temples, the weight of the moment bending his shoulders. "Daniel, you know we can't approve that kind of spend without going through finance." "Then talk to finance," I said, my tone flat as stone. "Because the clock is ticking and every hour you stall is another hour Norland loses faith." The legal woman's fingers tapped across her keyboard. She looked up, cautious. "Would you consider limiting your scope of support? I'll answer questions. I'll walk your team through the essentials. But I won't be working around your schedule," I said, each word sharp as glass. "You'll work around mine." They had no choice, and they knew it. Hal nodded, his face pale. We'll draw up an agreement." I gave a small smile. "Good. Send the contract. Once I see the funds, we'll schedule the first session." Then I clicked out before they could argue further. That afternoon, I received their transfer. The contract was short, stripped of legal flourishes, but binding enough. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't bending to them. They were bending to me. When I scheduled our first session, I picked the exact time the following day, when the chapel bells would ring for my father's eulogy. At 2:00 p.m., my phone buzzed non-stop in my pocket as the pastor spoke about my father's kindness and strength. Heads turned at the sound, but I didn't move. I kept my eyes on the coffin, on the man who had always taught me what urgence really meant. Under my breath, I whispered, "Now they know." The next day I logged on, and their faces told the story before a word was spoken. Hal looked like he hadn't slept. Cheryl's lipstick was cracked, and HR's voice trembled as she tried to begin. I didn't offer small talk. I shared my screen and walked them through the chaos they had created without me. Every misstep, every broken link, every failed script, they were exposed line by line. By the halfway mark, they had stopped interrupting. They just nodded, typing furiously, their confidence bleeding out with every correction I offered. When the call ended, Hal tried to salvage a shred of control. "We appreciate your help, Daniel. This was necessary." Cheryl added through clenched teeth. We'll need you back Monday to finalize the rest. I shook my head slowly. Not in our contract. If you have more questions, put them in writing. I'll respond when I can. You can't just... Cheryl began, but I cut her off again. I won't work around your schedule. You'll work around mine. Then I closed the meeting with a click. As I sat back in the quiet of my father's kitchen, coffee cooling beside me, the calls started again, more frantic than before. They were tied to me now, chained to the very lifeline they once dismissed. For years they had demanded everything on their terms. Now, finally, the balance had shifted, but as I stared out the window at the pale winter sun rising over the fields, I knew this was only half the battle. They would offer more. They would beg, bargain, maybe even try to buy me back with titles and money. And when that moment came, I would decide how deep their debt to me would go. By the time winter melted into spring, the cracks in my old company had widened into canyons. Norland pulled the plug on their contract, citing irreparable delays, and within weeks, 2 more clients announced they were reviewing their agreements. Word traveled fast in that industry, faster than any memo or press release. By early summer, the place I had once given every ounce of myself to was a shell of its former self, its reputation shredded by the very negligence they had tried to bury under my silence. One afternoon, as I sat in my father's garage sorting through the last of his tools, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I answered out of habit, and Hal's voice filled the line, tired but still rehearsed. Daniel, the board wants to offer you something real this time. Director level, 50% raise, remote flexibility, a full team under you. We want to do right by you now. For a moment I let the offer hang in the air, staring at the old workbench where my father's hammer still lay. Then I said what had been waiting in my chest since the day they denied me those 4 days. Too late. I ended the call without ceremony. 2 weeks later, I walked into the office of a small firm in Columbus. 10 people, 1 floor, the kind of place where the CEO brewed his own coffee in the morning. During my second call with him, he leaned back in his chair and asked the one question no one at my old job ever bothered with. How are you holding up after losing your dad? The words caught me off guard, not because I didn't know how to answer, but because they were asked at all. In that simple moment, I realized I had finally stepped into a place where family wasn't a footnote, but the headline. 6 months passed quietly. I slept through nights without being jolted awake by emails. I mowed my father's lawn, cleaned out the garage, and began reshaping the space into something alive again. Then one evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, a notification appeared on my phone. A message from Hal, of all people. I know I handled things wrong. I'm trying to change. You were right about all of it. Your dad sounded like a remarkable man. I stared at the words for a long time, my thumb hovering. Finally, I typed back a single sentence. He was remarkable. Thanks for recognizing it. That was enough. No more, no less. But the story didn't end there. A week later, an email arrived from Norland themselves. It wasn't routed through my old company. This was direct. They had reviewed how I'd managed the chaos, how I had balanced honoring my father while still salvaging parts of the migration. We respect your decision to put family first, it read. But we also believe in the clarity and discipline you brought when everything was collapsing. We'd like to discuss an independent consulting arrangement with you. I sat back in my chair, reading it twice. For the first time, someone in this industry had said the words I had waited years to hear: family first, but your work still mattered. That night, I pulled open the small drawer in my father's workbench. Inside was the wooden pendant he had started carving, walnut smooth under my fingers. The loop finally drilled, the edges sanded by my own hands over the months since. I placed it on the desk beside my laptop, the grain catching the light. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid, just like him. Looking at that pendant, I thought back to everything I had walked through. The humiliation in Cheryl's office, the silence in the elevator, the rage that drove me to strip back what was mine. And now the quiet satisfaction of knowing I didn't have to destroy them to win. I only had to walk away carrying with me everything they had overlooked until it was gone. Sometimes revenge isn't fire or ruin. Sometimes it's the calm after the storm, the clarity of seeing who truly valued you all along. As I shut down my laptop and sipped the last of my coffee, I whispered into the empty garage more to myself than anyone else. Sometimes the strongest move isn't burning it down, it's walking away with everything they never valued. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. The war was over, and I had won it not with noise, but with silence, with dignity, and with the inheritance my father left me to build things that last. And that's how it ended. I didn't need to burn bridges or tear the company apart to win. All I had to do was walk away with my dignity, my father's legacy, and the lifeline they never valued until it was gone. Sometimes revenge isn't about destruction. It's about reminding people what can't be replaced once it's lost. If this story made you think about what truly matters, family, respect, and justice, then don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe walking away can be the most powerful form of revenge, or should people always fight back head on?